Welcome back to the third and final part of the tutorial. We're temporarily in Photoshop, where I have created, and whenever YouTube changes, I'm having to recreate a Photoshop file that contains all the graphic elements of the player. I made that by just screen grabbing some actual playing YouTube player and getting rid of the imagery that's there, and kind of putting each of these little things that the player can do on its own layer. And I put them together in a specific way that I know is convenient for me so that I can rig them up to work in After Effects. So let's do that rigging process together. Here I'm importing the Photoshop file into After Effects, and I'm choosing to import it as a composition because it's a Photoshop file with a bunch of layers. So I want them all to come in as layers of a composition, and I'm choosing to retain the layer sizes. So if something is a small object, it's going to just be the size of that object instead of the entire picture. So I'm going to say OK, and here we have that same Photoshop file we were just looking at as a composition. But I don't want to do anything inside of this composition. I'm going to put all of its layers into the composition I already created for my video. So I'm going to press Command C, and here I'm going to press Command V to paste. Now I can close this, we don't need it anymore. So let's organize these layers a little bit. We have our background, and then we have our interface panel, and the various buttons that happen here, and the playback bar. So because of the way the interface is set up at the time I'm recording this, maybe by the time you're watching it, YouTube has changed how this looks completely, but right now the way it looks is that there's a kind of a semi-transparent dark interface that fades a little bit up into the main image. So to do that, I'm gonna make sure that my interface is in the transfer mode of add, so that we just see the white buttons, the white icons. I'll do the same thing with this pause button, make it add, and the play button, add. Now all of this is just floating in space, and I can take this background layer, add a rectangular mask to it, move that mask down to the border, then unlink its dimensions of its feather and just feather it vertically so that we have this kind of fall off. And now I'll press T and make it a little bit transparent like that. So that kind of looks like how YouTube actually looks. Next, we have this playback bar, which has like a background that's gray, and then the part that shows you how much has played, which we could just move. But when we move it, the bar, it doesn't go all the way to the edges of the screen. So when we move it, we don't want it to go all the way in here. We just want it to get cut off over here. So for that purpose, I made another little bar on top of this that I will use as a mask. So I will just set it to alpha matte. And now when I move the played bar, it gets cut off here on the left, but it's showing me progress on the right. So let's position it like somewhere here, as if the video was getting played somewhere other than the beginning, somewhere over here. And the button that's visible right now is the play button because the video is paused. This is correct. And we have the big play button here. So this is the state everything should be in. While I'm pulling the player out and holding it, it's all fine. But at the point that I press play, right there, the hover red color of the button should appear. So I will activate it, and I will also set the in point, alt like bracket there, and I'll set the out point on the previous frame for the gray version of the button. And then from this point on, with the big red play button, I'm going to press T and Shift S to open the scale and opacity properties of it. Add keyframes to them. Go about, I don't know, like shift page down to go 10 frames. That should be enough to animate the button getting a little bit bigger and also fading off to nothing. So now, when I press it, this will happen. Boom. At the same time, once this is being played, this button should now switch to pause. So play button has an out point, Alt, right bracket at this point, and at this point, the pause button will be in play. Also from that point, the progress bar should start moving. So I'm going to select it, press P for its position property, add a keyframe to the position, and go all the way down to the end, and just move the X position to about here. Let's say it's a short clip. So let's see what we got. That works. And at this point, we've done what's the realistic behavior of the player, but I think I'd like to emphasize things a little bit. And, you know, when I'm holding it here, it's just already looking all perfect and clean. And when I play, it just starts moving. It's a very subtle change. Sometimes it's better to change the look of the still frame compared to when it starts playing. So I'm going to make things a little bit duller while they're frozen. So I'm going to go select my actual cat's layer and add an adjustment layer above it by pressing Command Alt Y. Then I'll go down to where the playback begins and set an out point for that layer. And then let's go, I guess, to color correction exposure and see if we can, let's lower the exposure, but also raise the offset a little bit. So it's just kind of a dull picture. And maybe I'll also color correction tint it to not quite all the way to black and white, but just a little bit less saturated. So now we have this still, and when I play, it becomes nice and fresh and clean. Let's see. Looks good to me. Oh, except take a look at this. The margins, you know, remember how we kind of made a little bit of margins? They're kind of cutting off our interface here in a not very good looking way. We tried to keep that margin as minimal as possible, but and here there's a bit of room from the border, but it just happens to be too much. How do we fix this? Well, we could go here, on top of everything, add a null layer, and then select all the elements of the YouTube player interface except the background itself, except this part. So I'll select everything from the play button to the interface and parent it to that null. And now I can just shrink the null a little bit and see if that creates enough spacing. There you go. That looks a lot better. Finally, I guess we could call this done, right? But let's say, as often happens to me, that, you know, I thought that I was going to hold the player like this and you were going to look at the video, and like when I bring it close, you were going to be able to see everything. But the video needs to last longer or something, or it needs to continue to show you other things. And it's just not going to work for me to just hold it there because my shot ends, but this video keeps going. So what I'd like to do, what I wish I would have done, is that I pushed it forward to where it just becomes a full screen image. Can I take this and make it into that somehow? Let's try to do that as a final little flourish to our tutorial. What would it take to kind of do that smoothly and convincingly? Well, I guess somewhere where I'm beginning this push forward, I need to find a spot, maybe the frame where my face gets fully covered, so we're just switching our full attention to the player now. I'm going to need to have a fake animation of this panel moving, take over from this point on. So let's take the player content and duplicate it and place that on top of everything. So here's our crazy expanded player, But I'm going to go back to that motion tile effect and just reset everything back to normal. And in fact, now we need to do the opposite. We need to kind of crop away that margin we created. So I'm going to hold Control while I slide this output width to where it meets. I hope it's clear what I'm doing here. Here's the real video, or the effect we just finished working on. And here's another version of the player on top. And what I'd like to do is line them up exactly, the margins. And I'll do now the same thing with the vertical margins. There we go. So here we have another version of the player kind of appearing on top. But it's going to happen, and I'll go ahead and make this the endpoint of this layer. So from here, everything is going along normally, and at this frame, the player on top takes over. So now we have the freedom to animate this however we want, because it's covering me, it's covering everything, and then we'll have to get my hand to still be on top of the player. But let's not worry about that yet. Let's open the keyframes of this topmost player by pressing U, and we can see all of those corner pin position keyframes. The first one has to be what it is, but after it, we don't need these keyframes. And let's decide on where, in fact, I'll turn it off for a second. Let's kind of decide where would be natural for the real full screen video to land. I guess about here. Maybe that's a bit too long. Maybe this many frames. So I'll delete everything after that. And on this frame, I'm going to reset the corner pin effect so that the image is no longer distorted, and I'm going to reset the position so that it's in the center. And also I have to reset my motion tile, but I have to animate that. So let's press Shift E, open the motion tile effect, animate the output width, put keyframes on this frame for output width and output height, and on the first frame of the movement. And here we're going to set them to 100. We'll set these keyframes to be eased by pressing F9, and so all of these as well. So what do we end up with? Something like this. Maybe I could afford to move everything one frame back. I mean, make it last one frame longer, the movement. I think that works. So the only thing that doesn't look right now is that my hand disappears instantly. Instead, I'd like my hand to remain there until I've placed it all the way in full screen, and then I kind of let it go and my hand disappears. How do we do that? I think what I'll do is I'll go to the very last frame where my hand is visible, go in here, take that decast layer, duplicate it, I'll unhook it from any kind of track mat, put it on top of everything else. And while we're on this frame which is the last frame we see my real hand, I'm going to right click, go to time, and choose freeze frame. So we just have this clip just be this frame always. And I'll set its endpoint on this frame for now. And I'm going to roto, trace out my hand. And I can be very precise because I only need to do this on this single frame. Now, I'm not going to worry about that little part of my hand that goes underneath. Instead, I'm just going to create a nice smooth shape. All right. Now I'll temporarily set it to none so I could make some adjustments. That's cool. And the hand comes with a shadow, of course. If we just have the hand, the shadow will vanish, and that'll be just as bad. So let's trace the shadow as well. Log this guy and simply do this. All right. Now for the hand, I'll give it a feather of 2. For this guy, I'll give it a feather of 3, and also make it somewhat transparent. Now let's see here. I'm gonna set the endpoint here. Look at my previous, the real hand's shadow and this shadow, and try to adjust the transparency to kind of look similar. I guess that's about it. Yeah. Give it a little bit more softness with 5 pixels. Okay, so let's set its endpoint back here again. All that remains is to animate the hand to go with the player and then let it go. So starting with this frame on which it is in the right place and it's the right size, what I could do is just go into my player content and turn off our cats and kittens for a while and just go back to this grid, which is much easier to see where we're at. Here, for instance, there's a spot where the shadow from the finger crosses perfectly on the meeting point between these squares, and it's the third dark square in the second row here. So what I'll do is, by the way, let's just relabel this hand. Take the pivot point by pressing Y to move the pivot point with the Move Pivot Point tool, and put it on that spot. And at this point, I can press P for position, Shift S for scale, and create keyframes for them. Go to the frame, press U on, I guess, the player content. Go to the frame where it stops, and position my hand in the right place, which would be right there. And estimate the scale. I suppose I'd have to go back and check maybe where this shadow lands, which is just about in the middle of those two squares. So I made it a little bit too big. So more like this. And I'll ease these two keyframes. It looks like I'll need to do a little bit manual adjustment here at the very beginning of the move, because it does seem to get awfully big awfully fast. Let's see. All right. So this, I mean, it moves nicely with the clip, but you get to see a little bit of the other hand underneath kind of showing up from behind it. And I think the minimum that I'd need to do to fix that, I don't mind how the thumb kind of moves away. It almost looks like some sort of parallax, and maybe my thumb is lowering, but I do need to get rid of this little lump. So I could see an easy way to do that. Maybe take one of these frames where my hand is not occupying this space, and go back to I'll just create a little patch using footage of the wall. So I'll go back to the decast again, duplicate that, again turn off its matte. We're gonna need to freeze frame it. Freeze frame. and then go here where the problem starts and create a small mask. And there we go. Now it's just a matter of animating this mask. I'm going to go ahead and give it preemptively 2 pixel feather and mask keyframe the mask path. Let's go back and kind of selectively get rid of that finger. And that would be the first frame where it even appears. And this is about it. Or maybe not. Oh, no. Now, all that's left is to get the hand out of the way. So as soon as it lands into full screen position, I'm going to then keyframe it over the course of maybe 6 frames to just go up. Nothing fancy here, just upward. But I'll make that last keyframe linear so that it's not like I'm slowing down, it's just my hand is leaving at full speed. Maybe a little bit further, like this. I'll also turn on motion blur on the hand, by the way, might help. And let's have a graceful way of getting rid of the shadow as well. Maybe here I'm gonna open the mask properties for what is the shadow, which is this mask number 2. I'm gonna keyframe its feather and its opacity, and maybe even its expansion. Ease those keyframes, go all the way to where it's about to disappear, feather the shadow a lot, and make it fade away. And I guess I don't need to animate the expansion, so forget that. And just put that keyframe down 1. Now I can go back into the player content, turn on the kittens, and take a look at what is hopefully the finished product. It seems to me like once we have this full screen and my hand disappears, it would also make sense for the interface of the player to disappear. So just as my hand goes up, I'm going to go into the player content, and in order to make all of the different elements of the player interface disappear at the same time, I'm going to need to pre-compose them. Let's see. Select all of these guys. Command-Shift-C. I'll call this interface, and I'll say OK, except the different transfer modes get messed up. But I can just go in here, press F4, and check this little starburst thing. And then it respects all the different transfer modes of the different layers. And from this frame on, I can press T, add a keyframe to the opacity setting, and I don't know, 10 and 2, 12 frames for it to disappear into nothing. Let's take a look at that. And that's it. That's every aspect of the holding the player effect. It's a bit of a headache, but I think it makes a nice, visually interesting transition from one shot to another. Maybe you'll find some kind of use for it, or at least now you know how it's done. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.